Imagine walking into a grand mansion on the night of a Christmas ball. The chandeliers glisten, music drifts through the air, and laughter fills every corner. Guests in elegant gowns and polished shoes move through the hall, toasting to wealth, power, and tradition. Every detail seems perfect, every smile genuine. But beneath the glittering surface, hidden in the shadows of the kitchen, a story brews that no one above will ever see coming. A cook, unseen, underestimated, and unacknowledged, carries the weight of years of injustice. Her hands, which prepare the feast that fills the room with delight, also hold a secret power, a power that will shatter the illusion of grandeur and expose the fragility of a world built on oppression. Tonight, you will hear about the night when skill, patience, and silent fury collided in a way that no one in Charleston could forget. Charleston during the holiday season was a place wrapped in layers of elegance, charm, and festivity that captivated anyone who wandered through its decorated streets. Gentle lanterns flickered on porches, evergreen wreaths adorned tall doors, and the sound of carriage wheels echoed softly along the cobblestones as the wealthy prepared for their grandest nights of the year. To an outsider, the city appeared like a painting of harmony and celebration, where music floated through the cold winter air and the aroma of roasted chestnuts, spices, and warm bread drifted from the kitchens of large estates. Visitors often spoke of Charleston's Christmas season as proof of Southern hospitality and refinement, as though each glittering party was an expression of joy and generosity. But behind this picture-perfect world lay layers of silence, tension, and truths that were deliberately ignored. The festive lights dazzled, yet they cast long shadows over the very people who made such splendor possible. Inside the great houses of Charleston, the illusion became even thicker. Chandeliers sparkled like constellations, polished floors reflected candlelight, and the wealthy descended velvet-carpeted staircases wearing clothes imported from Europe. Musicians tuned their instruments. Servants hurried in choreographed motions to perfect every detail, and the air hummed with anticipation of the Christmas ball. Guests prided themselves on elegance, sophistication, and tradition. They believed themselves masters of culture, refinement, and prosperity. Yet their celebrations depended entirely on the labor of people who lived behind the scenes, unseen except when needed, unheard except when spoken to, and unthanked except on rare occasions, meant to maintain order rather than express genuine appreciation. Among those unseen individuals were the cooks who worked in the hot, windowless kitchens long before sunrise and long after guests had returned home. The enslaved cook central to this story was one of those individuals whose hands shaped the very experience that Charleston's elite cherished. She prepared every dish that made guests sigh with satisfaction, every dessert that drew admiration, every roasted meat, glazed ham, and spiced stew that defined the Southern Christmas table. She transformed raw ingredients into feasts worthy of celebration, yet she herself was never permitted to attend such gatherings, to smile among the guests, or to enjoy even a fraction of the pleasures she helped create. She was not a guest, not an equal, not even a name anyone cared to remember. She was simply the cook, a title that hid the truth of her skill, her spirit, and her suffering. Her kitchen was her kingdom and her prison. The wealthy saw only the results of her labor, not the endurance it required. The heat from the great brick ovens wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. The smoke stung her eyes, and the endless orders kept her hands in motion even when they trembled from exhaustion. Still, the illusion of Charleston's grandeur depended on her. Every year, the Christmas ball was praised as the pinnacle of refinement, yet every year she worked through pain, hunger, and long hours to ensure that the illusion remained unbroken. Guests lifted glasses of fine wine to toast the season, unaware that the person who had prepared their meals had not eaten a warm, peaceful dinner in years. Their appreciation was directed toward the host, the decor, the entertainment, never toward the invisible labor that created their joy. The contrast between the world upstairs and the world in the kitchen could not have been sharper. While music drifted down from the ballroom, laughter trembled through the wooden floors, and dancers glided across polished boards. Downstairs, the rhythm was different. The scrape of knives, the thud of heavy pots, the crackle of firewood, and the steady beating of a heart that carried memories of sorrow and endurance. The cook had her own understanding of Christmas, not as a celebration of generosity, but as a reminder of how far removed she was from the humanity others freely enjoyed. The decorations, the gowns, the sparkling ornaments were symbols not of beauty, but of the wealth built on the backs of enslaved bodies like hers. The very grandeur people admired was inseparable from the suffering that sustained it. As the Christmas season approached, Charleston's wealthy looked forward to indulgence, lavish meals, sweet wines, roasted delicacies, and the luxury of forgetting troubles for a night. But enslaved people had no such escape. For them, Christmas did not bring rest. It brought more work, more demands, more pressure to uphold the illusion of prosperity. The cook carried the weight of those expectations every year, watching the world celebrate while she endured the same chain of responsibilities without acknowledgement, rest, or reward. Her identity was confined to her usefulness, her worth measured in dishes rather than dreams. She knew that the world that glittered above her was built on a foundation of injustice, yet she was forced to remain silent, her thoughts guarded, her emotions concealed behind the careful discipline taught by survival. Charleston's holiday grandeur was therefore not merely a festive atmosphere, but a performance, a carefully constructed image meant to distract from the harsh reality of human inequality. The wealthy enjoyed the illusion, believing themselves benevolent, refined, and secure. They never stopped to consider the cost of such magnificence or the quiet suffering occurring just beyond the glow of their lanterns. The cook saw it all with clear eyes. She understood that the elegance of the Christmas ball was not an expression of true joy, but a mask, a glittering disguise for a system built on control, domination, and exploitation. She could smell the hypocrisy as vividly as the spices in her pots, and she carried that awareness in her heart every day as she prepared the feasts that made Charleston's holiday season unforgettable for those who attended. The enslaved cook at the heart of this story lived a life shaped by silence, not by choice, but by necessity. Her world was carved by countless small and large wounds, many of which never left visible marks yet cut deeper than any blade could. She moved through the kitchen like a shadow, her steps trained, her hands disciplined, her face composed even when her spirit trembled under the weight of memories she could never speak of. Her skill in the kitchen was renowned among the household. They praised the flavors she produced, admired the beauty of her dishes, and never considered that behind every plate lay years of struggle, resilience, and pain. They saw her as a provider of comfort, a maker of feasts, a dependable pair of hands, yet never once imagined the story of the woman behind the apron. She had been trained from youth to understand that silence was safer than truth. Every emotion, every frustration, every dream had to be tucked away like scraps of food hidden beneath the cutting board. She learned early that speaking too boldly could result in punishment, that expressing pain could be dismissed as defiance, and that showing weakness could be used against her. So she became an expert not only in cooking but in hiding her fears, her anger, her longing, her memories of a life before bondage. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the shadows on the walls, remembering voices she had lost and faces she would never see again. But each morning she rose before the sun, stepped into the kitchen's heat, and wore her silence like armor. Those around her admired her expertise, but never her humanity. Her skill was spoken of as though it came from nowhere, as though excellence simply sprouted in enslaved bodies without effort, training, or passion. They ignored the years she spent learning flavors, mastering spices, perfecting techniques passed down from women who whispered their wisdom when no overseer was listening. They overlooked the precision with which she handled knives, the intuition that guided her seasoning, and the creativity she infused into dishes that guests would praise without ever knowing the mind that crafted them. To them, she was a function, not a person. Someone who existed only to serve, to produce, to obey. Yet inside, she carried a storm. Every insult she endured, every command barked without courtesy, every moment of disrespect added to the weight pressing on her chest. She remembered the times she was forced to cook for celebrations honoring achievements she was never allowed to pursue. She remembered being scolded for mistakes she did not make, punished for the moods or misfortunes of others, denied rest even when her body ached with exhaustion. She remembered being treated as an extension of the kitchen rather than a woman with thoughts, emotions, and worth. Each memory lived inside her like a scar, one layered atop another, forming a history no one cared to ask about. But her silence did not mean she lacked awareness. She saw everything, the way the wealthy praised the dishes she made but ignored her existence when she passed by, the way they demanded perfection but refused to acknowledge the effort behind it, the way they believed themselves kind simply because they did not beat her, never realizing the psychological chains they placed on her soul. She saw the contradictions woven into their lives, their sermons about charity on Sunday mornings, their cruelty behind closed doors, their belief in hospitality while denying her the basic dignity owed to a human being. She witnessed their triumphs, their hypocrisies, their weaknesses, and their fears. And though she never voiced what she saw, she carried those observations like stones in her pockets. There were moments when her pain came close to breaking through her composed exterior. Sometimes a harsh word would sting more than usual, hitting an old bruise in her memory. Sometimes she would catch her reflection in a pot and hardly recognize the woman staring back. The eyes tired, the shoulders tense, the mouth set in a line of resignation. She would pause only for a breath, then continue working, knowing that time for grieving was a luxury she did not possess. But beneath the discipline, beneath the endurance, a slow burning fire lived. It smoldered quietly, fed by injustices small and large, waiting for the day when a spark would bring all the hidden emotions to the surface. Though the household saw her as a silent figure, she was far more complex. She had once loved to laugh before slaves were not allowed laughter. She had once known warmth before it was stripped from her. She had once belonged to a family before that family was torn apart. The woman who stirred pots and kneaded dough carried with her the memory of a past life and the longing for a future she knew she might never reach. Each dish she created held remnants of those memories, flavors from her childhood, scents from her homeland, techniques passed down like heirlooms. In the quiet moments when she could shape dough or grind spices, she felt connected to the ancestors who had also survived impossible circumstances. Cooking was her act of resilience, her way of preserving fragments of identity in a world determined to erase them. Yet the very skill that gave her strength also bound her to the people who oppressed her. They depended on her talent while denying her humanity, creating a relationship that was deeply complex and deeply painful. Every compliment tossed casually in her direction reminded her that they valued the work of her hands, but not the story of her heart. Every demand reminded her that she existed to serve, never to live freely. Every holiday, every feast, every celebration reminded her that she contributed to joy she was never allowed to partake in. and with every passing year, the gap between her silent suffering and her outward obedience widened, forming a quiet rebellion inside her that grew stronger, sharper, and more dangerous over time. Every great act of defiance, no matter how shocking or calculated, begins with a moment that shatters whatever thin thread of tolerance a person has left. For the enslaved cook, years of pain had accumulated like layers of dust settling silently on shelves, always there, never addressed, ignored by those who caused it. She had endured insults, survived humiliations, and swallowed anger for so long that it became part of her daily bread. Over time, she had learned to mask her emotions so well that even those closest to her could not always see when her heart trembled. But every human spirit, no matter how disciplined, has a limit. And for her, that limit arrived unexpectedly, violently, and with a force that pierced through every wall she had built to protect herself. The incident did not come as a single grand tragedy, but as a culmination of countless smaller cruelties, each of which had chipped away at her spirit. Yet this final act, whether it was a slap that left her cheek burning, a word laced with venom that sliced through her dignity, a punishment inflicted without cause, or a humiliation staged before others, struck her in a way nothing else had. It did not matter whether it came from a moment of careless anger or deliberate maliciousness. What mattered was that, in that instant, she realized something inside her had snapped. She could no longer bear the constant disrespect or the way her humanity was treated like an inconvenience. She could feel herself sinking into a place where fear had no power over her anymore. What made this moment different from all the others was the timing. It came at a point when the Christmas ball was only days away, when preparations were at their most intense, and she was expected to perform miracles in the kitchen. Her life had always been measured by her usefulness. Now, during the grandest celebration of the year, the household depended on her more than ever. The pressure to deliver perfection pressed down on her shoulders, even as the wounds from the latest cruelty throbbed beneath her clothes. She stood quietly in her kitchen, hands trembling for a moment before she steadied them. She had learned long ago to calm her body even when her soul was in turmoil. But this time something was different. Something had ignited. In the solitude of the kitchen, she felt the heavy silence settling around her. The smell of spices lingered in the air, the fire crackled, and the pots simmered as though nothing had changed. But inside her, a transformation was taking place. She began replaying the events that had led to this point. The years of being forced to serve people who denied her personhood, the birthdays and holidays that meant joy for others, but more labor for her, the memories of loved ones taken, the long nights she had endured alone, the dismissive voices that told her she was nothing more than property. Each memory was a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of the pain that had defined her existence. And as she remembered, she felt her heart grow colder, steadier, sharper. The final act of cruelty became the spark that ignited all the buried resentment she had carried for so long. It was not simply that she had been wronged. She had been wronged too many times to count. It was the realization that there would be no end to it. She was expected to continue living in suffering without question, to continue providing excellence without gratitude, to continue giving of herself while receiving nothing but commands. She understood in that moment that nothing would change unless she changed it. The world around her would continue crushing her spirit until there was nothing left. The injustice she endured was not an exception or an accident. It was the rule. She stood in the kitchen that night, staring at her tools, her ingredients, the familiar surroundings that had become both her cage and her sanctuary. The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating a weary strength that had been building inside her for years. She felt her breath deepen, her mind clear, and a sense of purpose take shape. She had spent her entire life reacting to the cruelty of others, but now she was thinking, planning, moving with intention. The fear that once dictated her choices was no longer present. It had been replaced by something far more potent, a determination that grew with each passing moment. What the household did not understand was that a person who has endured too much does not react with sudden rage. Instead, their decision arrives with an eerie calm, and that was the state she found herself in. Her hands, which had once trembled from shock, now moved with steady precision. She chopped vegetables with rhythmic control, stirred pots with thoughtful focus, and cleaned her workspace with silent calculation. Every action she performed in the kitchen took on a new meaning. These were not just preparations for another feast. These were the steps of a woman who had reached the edge of her endurance and had decided that she would not be pushed further. She had always used the kitchen to create comfort for others, but now she recognized that this space, which had been forced upon her, could also be the place where she reclaimed power. It was the one domain where she held knowledge others did not. It was the one part of the household where she could move without constant oversight. It was the one place where she could turn her pain into action with no one noticing until it was too late. As she moved through the kitchen, she felt the weight of her decision settling upon her like a cloak. Not light, not easy, but undeniably hers. She did not think of the consequences because consequences had defined her life from the beginning. Instead, she thought of the moment she had reached her limit, the voice inside her that finally said enough, and the understanding that nothing in her life would ever change if she continued to endure what she had endured. The catalyst had not created her resolve, it had only revealed it. Inside her, a new version of herself had awakened, one who no longer feared the people who tried to break her, one who no longer believed in endurance without purpose, one who understood that acts of cruelty can forge a strength even the oppressor cannot predict. On the night of the Christmas ball, the mansion glowed like a jewel against the winter darkness. Lanterns flickered along the pathways, casting soft halos of light that guided carriages to the entrance. The sound of horses, the rustle of silk gowns, and the laughter of arriving guests floated through the cold evening air. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with ornaments, ribbons, and wreaths. The wealthy of Charleston gathered in their brightest attire, eager to indulge in a night of music, gossip, and feasting. They spoke of business, marriages, and fortunes, never imagining that the grandest danger of the night waited quietly in the dishes they were about to admire. While the guests admired the decor and exchanged compliments on the beauty of the celebration, the cook worked in the kitchen with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural given the scale of the event. Her movements were precise, measured, and controlled. She prepared every dish with the same expertise she had always shown, but tonight her hands carried a different intention. She worked without haste, without panic, without any sign that her heart was anything but steady. Yet inside, her resolve pulsed with each breath, guiding her through the plan she had crafted in silence. She knew the household trusted her blindly. They never questioned her ingredients, her methods, or her choices. That trust, born from arrogance, not respect, was the weakness she now used. The kitchen was filled with aromas that promised delight. Rich sauces simmering softly, roasted meats releasing their savory perfume, pastries cooling on wooden racks, spices warming over the fire. These scents drifted upward, drawing compliments from the guests long before the first dish arrived. They praised the feast without seeing the hands behind it, never suspecting that the same hands had measured not only spices, but something far more dangerous. Every dish, every platter, every bowl carried a message the cook had spent years swallowing and could no longer keep inside. When she added the poison, she did so with the same care she gave to her seasoning. It was not a reckless act born of rage, but a deliberate decision crafted from years of silent suffering. She chose her moment carefully, ensuring that the dosage was enough to bring chaos without immediately revealing the cause. She knew the exact flavors that could mask the bitterness, the exact textures that could conceal the presence of anything unusual. The poison blended so seamlessly into the meal that even the most refined palate could not detect it. Her expertise became her weapon, and her knowledge, once used to please, was now used to reclaim a fragment of the power she had long been denied. As the servants carried the dishes upstairs, a hush of anticipation filled the ballroom. Guests leaned in, eager to taste the creations they had praised for years. They had no idea that the cook stood below, listening to the footsteps above her head, her breathing soft and controlled. She could imagine the looks of satisfaction on their faces, the murmurs of approval that always accompanied her dishes. She could imagine the exact moment when the first wave of discomfort would strike, subtle at first, a strange tightness in the stomach, a bitter taste that seemed out of place, a feeling they might attribute to too much wine or too little rest. The guests began to dine, praising the flavors, unaware that each bite carried more than indulgence. As the courses progressed, the atmosphere remained festive, cheerful, and oblivious. Men toasted with confidence, women laughed gently behind their fans, musicians played their instruments without missing a note. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the first signs appeared. One guest paused, placing a hand on their abdomen. Another felt lightheaded. A third suddenly lost their appetite, pushing their plate aside as a wave of nausea washed over them. The discomfort spread like a ripple through the room. At first, they tried to hide it, unwilling to spoil the evening, but as more guests felt the effects, whispers replaced laughter and unease replaced celebration. The cook remained in the kitchen listening. She knew the signs well. She had predicted them. Above her, chairs scraped the floor, voices rose in confusion, and the once cheerful music faltered as guests began to collapse. Servants rushed to assist, their panic echoing through the halls, and every footstep, every cry of alarm, every frantic command reached her ears with chilling clarity. The grand Christmas ball, the pride of the household, crumbled under the weight of the chaos she had set in motion. The household tried to regain control, shouting for the doctor, demanding explanations, and blaming the cold air, the wine, or some unknown illness. They never once suspected the cook, even in those moments. Their minds could not comprehend that the woman they had overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed could be capable of orchestrating such turmoil. But the truth was woven into every dish they had praised. The feast, which was supposed to elevate their status and entertain their guests, had become their downfall. The chaos grew. Some guests clutched their stomachs in agony, others fainted, and still others cried out in fear as the symptoms intensified. The ballroom, so elegant only moments before, became a scene of disarray. The glittering decorations looked absurd now, hanging above the contorted faces of the suffering. The musicians abandoned their instruments. Servants shouted to one another. And the master's voice, once so commanding and sure, now trembled with fear and confusion. And in the kitchen, the cook stood quietly, wiping her hands as she always did, her face unreadable. The fire crackled before her, casting warm light across the room, but inside her chest, a cold clarity remained. She had not acted in haste, but with intention. She had not lost control, but had taken it back in the only way the world had ever given her. The night that had been meant to honor the household and impress Charleston became the night that exposed its deepest vulnerability, and the cook watched from the shadows as the illusion shattered above her. The chaos that unfolded in the mansion that night spread with a speed that no one inside could comprehend. What began as subtle discomfort among a few guests soon erupted into a wave of panic that swallowed the ballroom whole. The elegant space, once filled with refined laughter, graceful dancing, and shimmering candlelight, now became a battleground of confusion. The wealthy elite, who prided themselves on composure and decorum, found themselves stripped of every illusion of control. Their polished manners crumbled as pain tightened their throats and fear clawed at their chests. Their carefully arranged hairstyles fell loose, their fine clothing became wrinkled and stained, and their voices, usually smooth and confident, cracked under the weight of terror. At first, no one understood what was happening. Some clutched at their stomachs as though struck by an invisible force, while others turned pale, gasping for breath. The musicians, startled by the sudden unrest, stopped playing mid-note, their instruments hanging awkwardly in their hands. Servants rushed from one suffering guest to another, trying desperately to offer water or steady their shaking bodies, but nothing seemed to help. A single cry for help turned into many, echoing against the once proud walls of the mansion. The air that had been perfumed with spices and warmth now felt heavy with dread. The master of the house, who had spent weeks preparing for this night of grand celebration, found himself powerless. His commanding voice, once enough to silence a room or restore order with a single phrase, now vanished under the noise of panic. He moved from guest to guest, his face tightening with each new collapse he witnessed. His pride, built over years of wealth and social standing, cracked like thin ice beneath a sudden weight. This was not a problem money could solve. This was not a moment where status could offer protection. The very foundation of his authority, his belief in the loyalty and obedience of those who worked for him, was slipping away with every passing second. The once perfect ballroom descended into a scene that resembled a nightmare. Chairs overturned as people stumbled, desperate for relief or escape. A woman fainted in the arms of another guest, her dress pooling around her like wilted silk. Another man collapsed onto the dance floor, the same floor where he had confidently shown off his steps only minutes earlier. The grand Christmas tree, adorned with ribbons and delicate ornaments, seemed almost mocking now, its beauty contrasting painfully with the suffering below it. Even the candles flickered in a strange way, their flames swaying wildly as though reacting to the energy of the room. Servants, who usually moved quietly and efficiently, now struggled to maintain any sense of order. They shouted instructions, fetched water, and tried to calm the guests, but their efforts were futile. Some of them were frightened not only by the illness spreading through the room, but by what it implied. They knew the kitchen better than anyone. They knew food did not simply turn poisonous on its own. They felt a chill in their bones, not from the cold, but from the unspoken understanding that something deliberate had been set in motion. Yet none dared to voice their suspicions. Fear held their tongues still. For many of the enslaved workers, this chaos was a moment of clarity. They watched as the powerful, the people who had controlled their lives, dictated their futures and treated them as property, became helpless. The very individuals who commanded respect without earning it, who punished mistakes without mercy, now begged for help. It was a reversal of roles no one in Charleston would ever have imagined. Their authority, which had seemed so solid, revealed itself to be nothing more than an illusion dependent on the silence and labor of the people they oppressed. When that silence broke, even subtly, everything they believed about their security shattered. Whispers spread among the guests as they clung to each other for support. They argued about the cause of their suffering. Some blamed the wine, others suspected illness carried by the winter air. A few even whispered that it was divine punishment. Not a single one considered that the cook downstairs, whose skill they had praised for years, could have been the one to turn the night into chaos. Their minds simply could not fathom that someone they dismissed as insignificant had the power to alter the course of their lives. Their inability to see her humanity now blinded them to the truth of their situation. As the symptoms intensified, panic turned into hysteria. People stumbled toward the exits, desperate to escape what they believed was a spreading sickness. Carriages were called in frantic waves, horses startled by the shouting voices. The cold night air outside quickly filled with confusion, tears, and unanswered questions. Inside the mansion, the decorations still hung neatly on the walls, as if mocking the disorder beneath them. The elegance remained intact, but the illusion had been permanently shattered, for among the chaos, the most profound truth revealed itself. The system that upheld Charleston's grandeur was fragile. It had always depended on the obedience of those it oppressed, and on this night, that obedience had been broken in the most unexpected way. Nothing the master had built, his wealth, his reputation, his social connections, could protect him from the consequences of years of cruelty. The feast he had commissioned to showcase his greatness had become the very thing that stripped him of the illusion of control he held so tightly. And while guests cried out, servants scrambled, and the master's world collapsed around him, the cook remained in the shadows of her kitchen, hearing the disorder unfold above her and knowing that the truth of that night would linger long after the last candle burned out. The story of the cook's rebellion did not end with the chaos of that Christmas ball, nor did it conclude with the immediate consequences faced by the household above her kitchen. Its echoes lingered in Charleston long after the candles burned out and the guests were gone. The legacy of her act of defiance extended far beyond the walls of the mansion, beyond the immediate spectacle of suffering and disorder, into the very consciousness of a city built on illusion and oppression. Her act became a silent warning woven into the fabric of history, a story whispered in the kitchens, alleyways, and hidden corners of Charleston by those who understood the quiet power of resistance. The cook's rebellion was more than vengeance. It was a testament to the endurance, intelligence, and unyielding spirit of those who had been stripped of recognition, denied justice, and forced to survive in a world designed to erase them. The act itself, calculated and deliberate, forced the city to confront truths it preferred to ignore. It revealed that the people who labored unseen, who endured brutality and deprivation, were not powerless. It demonstrated that those who had been treated as invisible, expendable, and voiceless carried within them a strength and understanding that could never be fully measured or contained. The cook's knowledge of the household, of the ingredients, of timing and trust, gave her power the wealthy could not imagine. For generations, the elite of Charleston had believed that their position of dominance was permanent, that obedience could always be enforced with fear and punishment. The events of that night shattered that assumption in ways that would be remembered long after the mansion was silent. Among the enslaved population, her rebellion became a story of hope and silent inspiration. Even those who could not speak openly about resistance understood that someone had dared to act on the injustice they all lived through daily. The cook's courage, her deliberate reclaiming of agency in a moment when it had been denied to her for years, became a lesson in patience, calculation, and quiet power. She showed that survival and defiance were not mutually exclusive, that the oppressed could navigate systems of control while finding the opportunity to assert themselves, and that their acts of resistance, though unseen by the world, could be devastatingly effective. In hushed conversations, in furtive glances across kitchen fires, the memory of her bravery circulated like an unspoken mantra. Endurance had limits, and courage could find ways to assert itself in even the most restricted spaces. To those who survived the Christmas ball, the memory was less a story of justice and more a confrontation with fear. The wealthy guests who had attended the event could not erase the image of their vulnerability from their minds. The knowledge that someone they had considered beneath them, someone whose presence they had taken for granted, had orchestrated their suffering, instilled a lingering unease. Every subsequent feast, every planned gathering, became tinged with doubt and anxiety. The illusion of control that the mansion's grandeur had always projected was forever fractured, revealing the fragility of social hierarchies built on domination and exploitation. Even as time passed, The memory of that night lingered as a shadow over Charleston's elite, a reminder that oppression carries within it the seeds of revolt. The cook herself became a symbol, though her story was rarely told in the language of the powerful. In the homes where enslaved people lived and worked, she became a figure of reverence and cautionary admiration. They saw in her the embodiment of agency, the courage to act when endurance could no longer suffice, and the intelligence required to turn skills developed under oppression into instruments of justice. Her identity transcended her individual circumstances, becoming emblematic of all those whose lives had been denied recognition, whose contributions had been erased, and whose resistance had been muted by fear. In kitchens, in workshops, and in fields, her story reminded others that invisibility could be temporary and that even the most confined lives held potential for defiance. Yet her legacy was not only one of fear and inspiration, it was also a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths to those who believed themselves untouchable. The Christmas ball, with all its elegance and order, had been a facade. The illusion of permanence, of security, of unchallenged authority was shattered because it rested on the labor and silence of the oppressed. The Cook's Act demonstrated that this foundation was unstable. Power, when exercised without respect for humanity, carried within it the inevitability of resistance. Even the most meticulously controlled environments could be undone from within, and the wealth and status of the powerful could not insulate them from the consequences of their cruelty. Her rebellion was, in essence, a revelation that systems built on domination were fragile, vulnerable, and temporary. Over time, the cook's story became a reminder of the human capacity for ingenuity under extreme conditions. She had endured years of servitude, oppression, and humiliation, yet she harnessed her knowledge, patience, and skill to turn the very tools of her subjugation into means of liberation, at least in that moment. She demonstrated that intelligence and courage could flourish even under oppression, that strategic action could reclaim agency when all other freedoms had been stripped away, and that acts of defiance need not be loud or public to carry profound consequences. Her actions forced both those who witnessed the chaos and those who learned of it later to acknowledge the power inherent in the unseen, the underestimated, and the disregarded. The legacy of the cook extended far beyond the walls of her immediate world. It was a story that challenged narratives of helplessness and submission often imposed on the oppressed. It reminded history that behind the grandeur and spectacle of Charleston's elite, there were lives filled with untold suffering, unrecognized skill, and unspoken fury. It illustrated the truth that resistance can take many forms, that power can be reclaimed in unexpected ways, and that even those deemed powerless by society can shape events in ways that alter the course of memory and reputation. Her rebellion was both a warning and an inspiration, a story carried in silence and whispered across generations, shaping the understanding of courage, agency, and justice in ways the mansion above could never have anticipated. The events of that Christmas night reveal more than a tale of vengeance. They reveal the truth about resilience, injustice, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. The cook's story reminds us that those who are overlooked, dismissed, or silenced are not powerless. Every insult endured, every wound hidden, every act of forced obedience can accumulate into a force too strong to contain. Her careful planning, her mastery of the kitchen, and her courage in reclaiming agency demonstrate that rebellion does not always roar. It can simmer silently until the moment is right. The chaos that unfolded that night shattered illusions of control and exposed the fragile foundations upon which privilege often rests. It serves as a timeless lesson that oppression breeds resistance, that humanity cannot be denied forever, and that even in the darkest corners, intelligence, courage, and the desire for justice can reshape history in ways the world never anticipates. The legacy of the cook is not only in the story itself, but in the reminder that every act of endurance and defiance matters, and that the invisible can, at the right moment, change everything.